Welcome back to iCanMod, and it's time today we're getting back into our What Is It series, and we're going to be looking at motherboards. So, what is a motherboard? Well, we've talked about CPUs, and if CPU, we consider that the brain of the computer. The motherboard would essentially be the backbone or the central nervous system. It's got a variety of different slots on it. Different things can be plugged in into it, like graphics cards, like your RAM, the CPU, and basically it provides the infrastructure so that everything can communicate efficiently. Now, your motherboard, also known as a MOBO, for those of us in the industry, it is the largest PCB or printed circuit board in your computer. It's essentially made up of the hardware component, so the printed circuit board and all the sockets that you have to plug everything in, like I mentioned, your graphics card or your RAM, and it has a software element known as the firmware. Now, firmware can be known as two different things depending on your board manufacturer. So it'd be known as BIOS, which is Basic Input Output System, or UEFI, which stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Pretty much everyone just refers to it as a BIOS. Whether it's known as BIOS or UEFI is strictly manufacturer or board type dependent. Now, the BIOS or the UEFI is a software that allows the manufacturer basically to correct small bugs and issues and also add more functionality in the future. So allow the board to accept newer generation CPUs. Think of AMD and their Ryzen series. They've been using the same socket on the motherboard, the AM4 socket, but they're able to update the board's firmware so that it will accept how the new CPUs operate, to make it in a very simple manner. But I guess most importantly, it also gives you as the user an interface to be able to change settings or tweak them so that you can get the most out of your system. Now, for example, most systems will come standard with your RAM set to 2400 megahertz, which is the industry standard. But you may have RAM that can run up to 3600 megahertz, and you can actually update and change that in the BIOS so that your RAM will run at its optimal speeds. All right, so before we get into talking about motherboards like the one I've got there behind me, I just wanted to make a note that we will actually be going more in depth about certain parts of your motherboard and how to select the right motherboard and things like that in another series that we call How To, which will be coming at the end of the What Is It series. So this will lead into that, and in that series we'll show you how to budget for your computer, learn how to choose the parts and make sure that they're all sort of cohesive and work together so that you get the best system possible for what your budget is. Let's talk about the biggest part of the board itself, which is the CPU socket. Now, this is an Intel board here, and it's got its cover on it there. So I'm going to take this off so that you can have a look. So the CPU would slot in there, which we'll show you how to do in our How To series once we get that one done. Now, with this one here, I put in this board here an Intel i5 900F processor, which meant when I chose that processor, I had to choose a board that had the right socket configuration. Okay, so this board or that CPU had a configuration known as LGA 1151. And in that case, that's why I've chosen this board, which is a MSI Z390 board. It has the LGA 1151 socket in it. Now look, you don't need to know every socket and every chipset that there is available. If you're choosing your CPU first, so if you have your heart set on a specific CPU, the manufacturer website or just information about the chip, the CPU itself, will tell you what chipset you need, which will then dictate what board you can get. So you'll be able to choose that from there. If you have your heart set on a specific motherboard, because it's got certain things that you need, like a certain amount of USB ports and things like that, which we'll go into in more depth in another series, then that will determine what CPU socket type you can buy. So if you've chosen an AMD board, as long as it's got an AM4 socket, it'll fit pretty much every Ryzen chip that there is out there. You just need to make sure they're compatible, okay? Using the manufacturer's websites or information on the box or from your local computer store, YouTube, whatever, will help you make that decision, but we will go into that. Now, the next thing I want to sort of talk about is the chipset itself. Now, the chipset for your motherboard is essentially the part that will allow the CPU to communicate with the rest of the components on the motherboard, things like your storage, your RAM, your graphics card, etc. So it is very wise when you're choosing your motherboard and your CPU especially, that you are checking the manufacturer's website to make sure that everything is compatible. And you'll notice that as a recurring theme here, that you need to do your checks, you need to make sure that you're choosing the right things that are compatible, otherwise you're going to be wasting money and spending it and then having to go and buy more stuff. Okay, now I told you this one was the MSI Z390 motherboard. Okay, and here we've got the ROG X570E gaming motherboard. You can generally find the chipset type in the name. So the chipset on this one is Z390, so it's a Z390 chipset, and on the ROG Strix board there, it's an X570 chipset. Time to talk ports. So we're going to start getting into the fun stuff now, but let's talk about the RAM port first. Okay, so, or the RAM slots, I should say. These are the RAM slots here on this Z390 motherboard. There's 4 of them. Now, RAM is essential for your computer to run. If you don't have it, it's not going to work. Okay, and depending on the type of board you get, you'll have between 2, 4, and 8 RAM slots. This will allow you to run different memory configurations, and that could be single, dual, or quad channel. This one here has a dual channel configuration because it has 4 ports. If your board's got 8, or RAM slots I should say, if your board's got 8 RAM slots, then you can run quad channel, and other boards will have other different configurations, so it's all about checking the manufacturer's website or the information that comes with it, because they all come with a user guide as to what configurations you can run on your board. Now, with this one here, most common PCs, they'll have 2 or 4. So an ATX board, which is the size of this, okay, because there are 3 sizes, which we'll talk about later. Most of them generally these days will have 4 ports or 4 slots. Anything smaller than this will have usually 2. And then when you get up to things like Ryzen Threadripper, those bigger sort of high-end boards, you're looking at 8 because they need the RAM capacities and speeds. Now with this one here, depending on the motherboard, it will have a rating to the highest frequency RAM or speed RAM that it can support. But once again, if you are looking at a motherboard at the moment, consult the manufacturer's website depending on the RAM that you're choosing. Right. So now that's the RAM. On this board, you'll see these horizontal slots here. Okay. Now these are known as your PCIe or Peripheral Component Interconnect Express ports. A bit of a mouthful, hence why we call it a PCIe port. And this is where you can slot in. Generally, your graphics card will go in here, usually in the top slot, because it'll have the most lanes, which I'll explain in a minute. But you can plug other things in here like sound cards, Ethernet, or network interface cards, or NICs as we call them. But any expansion, even the Elgato capture card will slot into one of these PCI slots. Okay, simple click design. When you're releasing it, you just push it down to release it, and when you push it in, it'll click in place. And they're all connected directly into the board itself. Now, PCIe slots are configured with a specific amount of lanes. Now, the more lanes, the higher the throughput of information that can be sent and received to that slot. Generally, the highest lane configuration is the top slot, where you would slot in your graphics card, because it's going to have the best communication between the CPU and the graphics card. All right. Obviously, depending on how the board is laid out, that could change, but that's the general rule of thumb. All right, one other major sort of part of the motherboard that we need to talk about these days is, with the advancements of storage, we now have called a M.2 drive, which is a storage drive, a little stick. I don't have one on hand because they're all in computers, that plugs directly into the motherboard. Now, some of you've, it's been a while since you've built a computer. You will remember SATA, so you got your SSDs and your hard disk drives, or spinning RAS drives as they call them, all plugged in via a cable to the board. We now have what's called an M.2 storage device, and it slots into a little slot like this. I'll get a close-up of it for you so you can see it, but your board may have those slots. If it does, that's going to give you the fastest possible communication between storage and the rest of your components. And it also depends on the type of drive that you buy too, the speed rating of the drive. But I use M.2s for running the major games that I play, any large file games, etc. I have them directly on an M.2 while I'm playing them, so I get the best performance if you're really trying to nitpick and get that sort of stuff out of it. I'm going to talk about choosing your motherboard size in the next series. I'm just going to make you aware that there are sort of 3 common sizes. Well, sorry, 4 I should say. It is 3, but there's a 4th one. We'll talk about that. Mini ITX, MATX, ATX, which is this one, and then EATX is the most uncommon because it's not a defined sort of size. EATX don't have really any sort of formal parameters on sizing. But they're the three major ones and the 4th outlier. What I want to do really quickly, and I'm going to get some close-ups of this for you to have a look at. Every board, we're going to take a walk around this board. Every board will come with, number one, your power ports. So you've got up here an 8-pin power adapter that's directly for the CPU, so that's to power the CPU. Your 24-pin port, which powers the board. Then you're going to have, depending on which board you choose, you're going to have a variety of different other options, or what we call headers. So there's a USB connector for your front panel. You've got a USB 3 connector for the front panel as well. And depending on the case, you may need both or just one of those. The case will tell you what to plug it into, as will the board diagram in the handbook. Then you're going to have other headers here. So usually down in the bottom corner here, and we'll get some close-ups of this. Generally, that's the connection for your power button and things at the front. You'll have a bunch of other USB sort of headers, and then everything is sort of labeled. So here I've got system fan 1, system fan 2 that run across the bottom here. The audio output for the front, so your front audio ports. Another system fan there, which you plug your back case fan into. And then up the top, you've got the CPU fan. So if you're running a air-cooled CPU fan, you plug it into there. And then there's also a pump fan as well. So you can plug if you've got an AIO or an all-in-one water cooler, you can plug the pump into that too. On the back, or your rear I/O, it's a bit of a bad thing. We'll get a close-up of that as well. The rear I/O is where all your rear USB ports, your network port, the audio and optical outs, and depending on the board you've got, like this one, you'll have you'll have ports to plug in monitors and things like that if you have onboard graphics with your CPU. Okay, I don't really want to go too much into what every little chip and everything on there is, because I think this is supposed to be fairly top level. I've given you the basics of what you need to know in order to make the right decision for yourself. And we'll go more in depth into that when we talk in the how-to series about motherboards and selecting the right one. So this is a motherboard and that is our video on the What Is It series about motherboards. Now I hope this information helps you better understand what a motherboard is and what role it plays in your computer. I've tried to keep it as top level as possible. I don't want to go too much into, what is a MOSFET, what is where all the power comes from, etc. So I just want you guys to keep an eye out on our next video. This is going to be an important one because it does relate back to the motherboard. It'll be looking at RAM and how it works. So it's great to be back. Really loving back filming now. It's good that we've got things rolling, and looking forward to sharing more great content with you. So for now, as we always say, keep building and keep learning.